We might also want to think about how the sample mean variances compare over time, so we could look at rolling samples. Just as you increase the length of the time series, how is it that the mean and the variance change? Another thing to look out for is a strong upward or downward trend in the time series. That suggests that there's something deterministic which can be removed. There are formal tests that can be used, and we'll discuss those later. I'll just set the window so that we can see 3 graphs at a time. Let's have a look at a plot of the stationary process. Let's have a look at how that compares against the mean. So it's difficult to make out here, but we've just plotted the mean and then the process itself, and we see that if we were to reflect it, there's not really much to separate the process. It would essentially look the same. And let's have a look at the example time series that we created. And let's plot the mean there. Okay, so now we can see a definite increasing trend, and the process doesn't reflect itself nicely about the mean. Some of this is really obvious. Let's do the same with the Barclays data. And again, Barclays, so the average over the 5 years is around 550 or so, and we see that the price itself has been moving around that significantly and not in a symmetrical fashion. Another way to identify whether a process is stationary or not is to look at the ACF. So we'll do that now. And the ACF on that, you can see it's got a sharp cutoff after lag 1. There's also something called a partial autocorrelation function. You can find it in your notes. And that's decaying exponentially. So that again does support the notion that this is a stationary process. So in a stationary process we expect to see a sharp cutoff, whereas if the process is non-stationary we can expect to see either a linear decay or a sinusoidal curve of something that's got a seasonal adjustment to it. If there's exponential decay, such as in the PACF here, then the process could still be stationary. Let's have a look at the example time series now. So in the example time series we can see that that's not stationary because of this linear decay in this correlation function. In the partial autocorrelation function we do see a sharp decay, but the linear decay in the ACF is enough to tell us that the process isn't stationary. Looking at Barclays data now, again we see a linear decay in the ACF, and the PACF cuts off, but the linear decay here is enough to confirm that we don't have stationarity. Another way to think about stationarity is to look at how the mean and variance change over time for the time series. And I've defined a function here to do so. I've just called it rolling mean variance. It's a short for loop. Okay, now let's have a look at the rolling mean variance of the stationary process. So we have 3 graphs, just increase the size of that. The first plot tells us how the mean varies as a percentage of the final mean as you increase the length of the sample time series. So for a sample of 100 we're getting pretty close to the actual mean, and then the process is just fluctuating above and below the mean. Something that we could expect for a stationary process. Similarly, looking at the rolling variance, so it starts off shooting off and then it decays, but then eventually it settles to being just above and below the 100% level as a percentage of the variance, so at the end of the process. So that's quite stable. And this final plot here, that's the log rolling variance compared to the rolling mean, just to see if there's any sort of particular trend between the variance and the mean here. And here all we see is that the mean relates to the variance just in a very concentrated way. Right, now let's see how this varies for the example time series. Oh, it's a bit messy there. We're looking at the example time series here. Do that again. And here what we see is that for our example time series, it's quite a different structure. The mean goes to around 20% and then increases almost at a quadratic rate, going up to the total. And the variance also shoots up, so this confirms to us that this isn't a stationary time series. Looking at the rolling variance against the rolling mean, or log of the rolling variance against the rolling mean, we see a linear relationship there. So again, it's not a stationary process. Let's compare that to Barclay's. Okay, and Barclay's has got quite a different structure. So it goes up as a mean approaching 100 and then going substantially above the final mean until it eventually decays. So this is telling us that the process goes above the mean for a period of time on average and then declines down to the mean, which would be the more recent falls in the share price that we've seen over the last 2 years. Looking at the rolling variance as a percentage, it's just going up and up. So as we see more and more volatility in the price, the variance increases. It's not stable over time. Looking at the comparison of the rolling mean to the log rolling variance, we're seeing a strange relationship here, which does tell us that we haven't got this constancy that we might expect between mean and variance relationships as you increase the size of the sample. So our tentative conclusion is that the rolling mean variance function, as well as the other plots that we've seen, suggest that the stationary process is stationary, surprise, surprise, and the example time series and Barclay's daily closing price are not stationary processes. Therefore, what we want to do is consider ways to make the process stationary. One way of doing so is to perform some form of monotone transformation, particularly looking to stabilise the variance, which you've noticed in both cases has been non-stationary. There are some functions that we can apply to the original time series and then look at the transformed series to see if that's stabilised. The usual functions to use are log, square root, and quartic functions, and they work for positive time series only, just because taking log or quartic roots of a negative number isn't allowed. These transformations tend to work quite well with financial data, and sometimes they can work with other data that is positive. It's difficult to tell which of these functions should be applied to transform the data. One way of deciding would be to fit a model in the end to all of these transformations and choose that which fits the data best. Another would be to look at plots and to see if the data is becoming more stationary, if you can imply that from the plots. Alternatively, you might look at that transformation which minimises the variance and makes it most stable. Okay, so let's do that. As I said before, we can't apply these transformations to the stationary process because it's got negative components to it. But let's look at the log, square root, and quartic of our example time series. And let's look at the plots that correspond to that. Okay. So here are the plots. We can see by looking at the plots here that the process has become more stable, so it's not varying as much as it did before, but there's still this increasing trend. So we would expect that the mean and variance are changing through time. Similarly, applying a square root, it's even more obvious. And with a quartic function, we can still see this increasing, albeit linearly increasing trend. Although we could work with all of these transformations, the log transformation seems to be the most linear. And let's consider what happens with the price data. So again, looking at log, square root, and quartic transformations and their associated plots. Okay, here the story is different. We're not seeing much of a change by performing the transformation. And looking at all three, it's difficult to separate between them. However, I might just opt for the log transformation. Again, the reasoning being that the theory would suggest that log price data has a more normal structure to it. Now let's take a look at differencing.